All right, students, welcome to Chapter 29. We're in Years of Civil Unrest, and we are going to start at 29.1, which is the Civil Rights Movement in general. Now, I know that we have briefly covered the Civil Rights era, but we are going to go a bit more in depth and talk about different elements, not just when it comes to racial issues, but we're going to talk about gender issues too. So there's a couple different layers to the Civil Rights Unit. Now, this is going to be a long unit. I'm just going to be upfront and honest with you about it. I'm going to try to chunk it into smaller sections, and I will hopefully not talk too long on them to try to spare you some time. But again, we're probably going to be in this unit for at least 10 days, okay? So be aware of that. So let's just jump right into it, okay? So right before the start of the Civil Rights era, we are looking at the United States, and if you guys remember, coming off of World War II and coming off of the Korean War, the United States is highly prosperous during this time frame. People have lots of money in the bank, they have cash, they have the ability to buy consumer products. Many of them are not questioning the government. There's the anti-communist crusades going on. So overall, though, people are living fairly well. Now, one thing, though, again, what starts to bubble up from the surface is that this is, America, democracy and capitalism against communism. And so these ideas of why is America better than communism if we still have people who are racially segregated? So that's where a lot of these ideas start to come from, where we need to look at ensuring equality of rights for all of our citizens in this country. So that's what really kicks off the civil rights era. We're going to cover a few things, though, that we've already covered briefly with. So a lot of this is just a refresher for you guys to reorient yourself back again. All right, so when we look at it, the Civil Rights Campaign really goes into overdrive in the 1960s. This is where you see the larger scale events. This is where you see the major legislation that is passed in order to really drive real social change. When Kennedy comes into office, he is a big proponent of improving civil rights. Let's make sure that Americans have equality of rights here. And so that's one of his campaign platforms that he comes in on, and he's really motivated to try to make these changes. However, he runs into a Congress that is pretty much a do-nothing Congress, also a Congress that has some very powerful Southern representatives and senators who block and make impasses and create problems for Kennedy. And so not much gets done under Kennedy when it comes to legislation. Now, does he get himself involved? Yes, him and his brother get involved, sending out troops and things along those natures when it needs to be done in order to try to keep the peace. So, early demonstrations, we've talked about these a little bit, so let's focus in on them a little bit more with some of the key players into them. What we first look at is the early lunch counter strikes. And these are organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is the organization that Martin Luther King Jr. is part of, and typically has a lot of ministers near the top in the top leadership positions. What happens is, of course, these young men, they walk in, there's 4 of them, and during this time, Woolworths is a major department store, but also has a lunch counter in there where you can go and sit down and get lunch. However, where they were at in Woolworths, they were not allowed as African Americans to sit down and get lunch. Instead, only white customers could do that. So they sat down and they said, we would like to be served. And they basically were told, we're not going to serve African Americans here, so you need to leave. And they refused to leave. Eventually what happens is Woolworths, they decide that they're going to call the police and have the police forcibly remove these people. And so they do. But the very next day, 25 students show up and sit at all the spots on the counter, blocking it so nobody can sit there. And they continue using this non-violent form of protest. So these are known as sit-ins, is where they start doing this. And they don't just do it here in Woolworths. They start to spread it out, and they start to go to more restaurants and more places. And eventually the city has to make adjustments and finally say, look, okay, you guys can sit at lunch counters and be served. All right, we'll give you that. We're gonna bend over and we're gonna finally capitulate and say yes, you guys can sit there. So as we can see, nonviolence is the key cornerstone to the civil rights movement. They could have resorted to violence to try to get their way, but it probably would have been met with even greater levels of violence, and you would have seen a race war in the South if that's the way it would have gone instead of this nonviolent approach that these students were taking. Since they see it so effective, they decide they're going to move it out and try it everywhere else that they can possibly do it. Now, when this starts to happen, this is mainly student protests that start to occur with this, and so it's a combination. It's white students and African American students starting to get involved with it. And a lady by the name of Ella Baker, she saw that the Martin Luther King's organization was not readily accepting of these college students and didn't necessarily have the support structure in place to really push college activism. So she proposes that they make a college version, and so they create the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission, the SNCC, under John Lewis, who led the group. And they continue to bring this protest to more college students throughout the South and other areas where there's segregation. And they're able to organize in large numbers. The leader, John Lewis, is a congressman from Alabama, and he's still in office actually today, the leader who started these protests. So as you can see, there are still some members of the civil rights group still alive and out there working to try to make changes out there too. With this large-scale intervening group, they're able to now coordinate and show up in large numbers to anywhere where they might be needed to formulate a protest. Would it be a swimming pool, or would it be another lunch counter? Would it be another restaurant? Would it be a stadium? Anything that they felt like they could protest and try to get desegregated, they would work towards that. And again, like I said, this happens with white students join them along with the African Americans. And it doesn't always go well because it's nonviolent protest. But if you notice in that very top corner photograph and the one on the bottom, these people would come up to those who were sitting there and doing nonviolent protest activities, and they would pour stuff on them. They'd pour drinks on them, they'd pour syrup on them, they'd throw powder on them, they'd hoot and holler, and they'd call them all sorts of offensive names. So it wasn't just like these people were sitting there and showing up and just parking and going, I'm just going to sit here. This is my nonviolent protest. They were getting actively harassed by these people. And often, if the city and the store was not willing to cave to their protest, these people would be arrested and thrown into jail too. So they were taking risk. You have to understand this. This wasn't a non-risky venture for them. All right, another group is a group called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. And what they did is they created a group called the Freedom Riders. And one of the things that happens in the South is on commercial buses, which a lot of people used during the era still, there was still segregation on the buses. Often you'd have a black bus and a white bus, how people could travel. And CORE, in direct violation of that, would jump onto and sit on buses and have them desegregated, and they would drive around the South challenging the law that they couldn't ride together. Now, they frequently did through the upper South. They didn't go to the what's known as the deep South because there was fear that there would be violence directed against them. And when they finally decided to in 1961 to go down there, they of course were met with violent protest. Robert Kennedy tries to intervene at first and asked Governor George Wallace to try to protect the Freedom Riders. And if we know anything about George Wallace, not a very good guy. Instead, he's like, no, we won't do anything about it. And they get attacked by a group of KKK members and other anti-civil rights protesters who eventually attack. And at one point, one of their buses is burned. So, I mean, they were taking a legitimate risk. Again, this isn't just people hopping onto a bus. They were facing legitimate violence against their person. And one of the things, though, that forces changes is that the federal government now has to get involved and say, this is an interstate commerce issue, which is directly something the Congress and the federal government can control. And they say, we're desegregating all interstate um, bus routes, so you can't segregate them anymore. According to federal law, these are now all desegregated. So you guys got to stop doing it. And so this allows the federal government to get a toehold into the civil rights issue and start to make changes from their end. All right. Next up, we have Birmingham. And if you guys remember about Birmingham, Birmingham's a place of some of the most violent protests of the civil rights eras. They would go down and they would just do peaceful protests. They would do sit-ins. They would march on the streets. They would attend church meetings or try to go to church meetings that were segregated and try to get their way in and sit in a church meeting. So Martin Luther King was leading a lot of this movement down in Birmingham, which was known during the time the most segregated city in the South. And on May 23rd, 1963, they go back out and they try to march again, and they are told they don't have a permit. And instead, what happens is that the protest turns violent. And I think we really covered this a lot in our other civil rights unit. So I just want to re-bring it back to you guys as an image here, okay? This changes a lot of people's minds about the civil rights movement. So first and foremost, people again are watching everything now happening on live TV. Same with the Vietnam War. And people watch on live TV these protesters attacked by police officers with billy clubs, by firefighters using high-powered hoses, by police officers sicking their dogs on people and ripping open their shirts. Martin Luther King Jr. gets arrested, and this really shocks the American system because we see people out there trying to peaceably protest and are attacked violently on the opposite end by government power. And with Martin Luther King being arrested, this creates a lot of sympathy for him too. And he writes one of his most poignant letters, and if you guys remember, it's the letter from the Birmingham jail. And he pens it during this time, and it becomes highly influential and gets read by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans throughout the country, and really starts to enact and push for change. After this protesting, there's a number of bombings that happen against high-profile African American leaders. And actually, for one of the first times in the civil rights era, the protests moved from non-violent to violent protests. And with that, the governor gets ready to send out a large number of police officers. And this forces, again, the federal government to act. And over about, I think it was a few thousand federal government military officers were sent down to the area to try to prevent the violence from occurring. So again, starts to push the government back into the scene. All right, lastly, you have on August 28, 1963, where over 200,000 people march on Washington, D.C., and Martin Luther King delivers his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which even still to this day rings with a lot of power and influence. And it's really impactful emotionally if you listen to it. So I'm going to go ahead and attach the speech onto this week's main timeline board. And if you guys have a few minutes, it would be nice for you to be able to watch it and hopefully learn a little bit more about this speech so that you can kind of see the emotion behind it and the leadership that Martin Luther King really brought to the movement. All right, guys, that ends this first section for us. Make sure you do your homework. Get on your decades project if you haven't started. And I will see you again tomorrow.